So hi and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature. We're looking at Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. We have already started reading an essay about that, and as I mentioned, this is like Nervous Conditions. We've picked an essay which is a very original intervention as well as a pretty comprehensive coverage of the novel, especially in the way that we would like to read it through the lenses of trauma fiction, trauma theory, etc. Now, if you remember the session we had just before this, we were looking at some of the philosophers of trauma theory. So we are referring to Cathy Carruth, we are referring to Anne Whitehead, we are referring to Roger Luckhurst, and the conceptual diagrams from trauma theory and how those can be mapped into something like this novel in Beloved. Now we'll just move on from that bit, and as you remember, this is an essay which talks about the color symbolism in Toni Morrison's novel. So how, for instance, the color red is an important marker, it's an important memory marker, is an important trauma marker, is an important psychological marker in the context of this essay, in the context of this novel in particular. So it's an interesting essay. It's a pretty original intervention, as I mentioned. At the same time, it talks about some, very close textual details in terms of corroborating his point. So we'll just move on from where we stopped last time, and this should be on your screen. So my argument here is that color symbolism constitutes an important and previously under-researched aspect of both Beloved's formal and conceptual links to the trauma paradigm, and trauma fiction's general tendency to draw in particular on literary techniques that mirror at a formal level the effects of trauma. Now, this is a reference to Anne Whitehead's work as well as Roger Luckhurst's works. But what is very clear, as you can see from the quotations, is the interesting convergence between literary techniques, literary representations, and the psychological condition of trauma, right? And that is that in a way is also the central philosophy in this course, right? Looking at the convergence of the literary and the traumatic orders, and how the literary order, the fictional order, which constitutes focalization, condensation, metaphorization, the figurative register, that figurative quality of language, how that is very uniquely equipped, shall we say, to talk about the psychological condition of trauma, the brokenness of trauma, the vulnerability of trauma, the fragility of trauma, and this very inside-looking quality of trauma, and how that all becomes pretty complicated. And that complication or the complexity is exactly what gives the literary medium a very unique vantage point, a privileged form of representation when it comes to the traumatic mind, the traumatic subject, right? The shattered subject in trauma. And of course, if you remember, we had read philosophical books about the shattered subject or the fragility of the subject. So Catherine Malabou being a very good case in point. So it is in the use of the color red that the issues of voicelessness, trauma, and troping are linked, right? So the color red symbolically connects different issues in a novel: voicelessness, trauma, and troping. As the novel narrates the characters' dealings with the psychological wounds inflicted on them, moving from shock and voicelessness to repression and finally to storytelling, it continuously utilizes color symbolism. In doing so, Beloved itself imitates symptoms of trauma by relying on the perpetual troping of trauma. Now, this bit is very, very interesting. So the novel Beloved begins to imitate symptoms of trauma. So there is some kind of a mimicry that is done. So even in the narrative design of the novel, it mimics the traumatic mind in terms of its cognitive confusion, in terms of its centerlessness, in terms of its play with space and time, and in terms of, most importantly, in terms of its ambivalent understanding of reality and spectrality. So all these issues become really interesting. So what we see here is the narrative shape, the narrative form, the narrative design, the narrative vehicle, or the narrative machine, shall we say, begins to mimic the traumatic condition, begins to mimic the traumatic reputation, the traumatic fragility, the traumatic centerlessness. So all these issues, all these aspects which characterize the traumatic condition begin to get mimicked by the very medium, with the very shape of the narrative in Beloved. So this concept denotes, this concept denotes a repeated usage of tropes in light of the fact that no other rendition of the traumatic event is possible, as it constitutes a separate world, because it is outside of everyday experience and is outside of ordinary language. So we've seen it even in Catherine Malabou, how the The ontology of the accident is always outside the everydayness of language, the everydayness of representation. I mean, that is what constitutes, that is what qualifies it as an accident or trauma in the first place. Thus, as Catriona Leahy explains in reference to Hartman, any proper telling or remembering of the event can only happen in a very act of evasion or in a perpetual troping of figurative language. Now, this is, again, wonderful. So, interestingly, evasion becomes a form of representation in a traumatic mind. So, not telling about the trauma, the untelling of the trauma, in a way, becomes the only telling possible, becomes the only representation possible. So, evasion is not the ontological opposite of representation. Evasion becomes a representative category or a representational category. So that becomes interesting in that sense. And also the perpetual troping of figurative language. So everything becomes a trope, a literary device, right? And this conversion of a condition to a device, whether it's a device of vocalization, a device of a metaphorization, a device of a metonymization, any kind of devising. And that devising of a condition to a literary condition, a literary figure, becomes perhaps the only possibility of representing it, right? So again, we're looking at evasion and making something figurative as the vantage points of traumatic representation rather than escape from reality, right? So this is the evasiveness of this kind of repetition, or the figurative quality of this kind of representation, is exactly what makes this medium of literature or literary fiction a very complex and uniquely equipped medium to talk about trauma, absence, horror, elision, etc., interruption. So coming back to color symbolism, while not technically a trope in a classical system of rhetorics, constitutes a particularly powerful realization of the concept of troping trauma and perpetual troping, which Hartman has coined in his much referred On Traumatic Knowledge and Literary Studies, for two reasons. First, the frequency of its appearance mimics repetition, compulsion, which also serves as the function of indicating the profound psychological and moral depths of traumatic experience, without attempting in vain to simply retell through ordinary language a primary experience which can never be captured. Right. So now this is the first reason why this traumatic troping through color becomes interesting or convenient, or something which we should pay a lot of attention to. First of all, the frequency of appearance, the fact that it appears so many times, that in a way is a very interesting approximation, or a very faithful approximation, a very authentic approximation of the traumatic repetition, something which keeps coming back, never quite goes away, right? And not just that, but also the retelling is not a retelling of in ordinary language. It's a retelling in a very figurative language, which manages to capture the moral and psychological depths of the traumatic experience. So the depth is also a very important indicator over here. Because the figurative language of literature, it captures depth. It has a different and added dimension. It's not just a surface retelling of what happens. It also goes into it offers some insights into the traumatic mind. And that added dimension of depth is something which gives a very interesting vantage point to this figurative quality of representation. And that just becomes very interesting. And authentic as well. And so we're looking at the authenticity of this representation, how it becomes a very close approximation, a very faithful approximation to the traumatic mind. Now, as such, it is part of trauma fiction's efforts of exploring new modes of referentiality, which works by means of figuration and indirection. Right, so figuration and indirection. Again, the indirectness is actually part of the representative strategy. The lack of directness, the lack of, and we were just talking about evasiveness, how evasion becomes a form of representation, how evasion becomes a vehicle, a modality of representation. So indirectness and obliqueness, coupled with figurativeness, all become interesting categories of representation. Second, Rosemary Winslow herself, while focusing on the role of different metaphors in first-person accounts of trauma, has commented elaborately on the usage and symbolic meanings of colors in a trauma patient's pictures. Furthermore, Barry Cohen, Winslow's source for a summary and definition of traumatic experience, does not strictly limit his elaborations to figurative language, as he explains why traumatized individuals crave metaphor and imagery to make sense of the worlds. Right, so this craving, and this is a very interesting word, craving for metaphors and imagery. It's almost like there's some kind of a, this desire to eat, desire to consume metaphors. The metaphor becomes some kind of an act of consumption, right? Creative consumption. So the traumatic mind, in order to fill the emptiness of it, it craves for the stylized category of representation. It craves for the embellished category of representation. It craves for the excessive category of representation to sort of regain or restore some sense of balance. Because if you look at trauma as an example of absence, as an experience of absence, as an experience in absence, shall we say, so that absence, that void in the traumatic mind, and that interruption, that absence, that void, can be compensated by consuming the embellished, by consuming the excessive, in a certain sense. So that therein lies the psychological relevance of metaphor and metonymy and different kinds of imagery, including color imagery, of course. So we can see the psychological quality over here in terms of the craving for figurative language, the craving for colors, the craving for excessive elements in representation. So conspicuously, in its troping of slavery and through the color red, the novel utilizes a visual marker rather than a verbal one. Analogous to Winslow's description of art, its visual nonlinear nature is closer to the actual experience than language can approach, and thus once more bespeaks the silencing effect of the traumatic event. Right. So the whole idea of silence becomes interesting. I know, as we were talking about earlier as well, absences can become forms of representation, evasion, silences, indirectness, obliqueness. All these can become very important markers of representation, right? So, and that quality is interesting. That quality, it gives us a sense of the difference or the defamiliarized mode of representation that a traumatic mind can connect, can cognitively connect to. Okay, so moving on, red seen as a highlighter. So the basis for my contention that red bespeaks the character's emotional labor with the trauma of slavery is a more general observation concerning its usage. Throughout Beloved, red symbolizes slavery and concepts associated with it, such as racist violence after a civil war. Now, this is evident in the fact that the color appears when characters face their memories of slavery and the horrific wounds it has caused them. Right, so red obviously is a corporeal marker for blood, for violence, for grotesqueness. So that obviously connects the level of imagery with slavery, with with the violence of slavery, with the torture, the abuse of the human body. Right, so in that sense, it very directly and cognitively connects to the history of violence, history of racist violence after a civil war. That is obviously a historical point in the story, right? So this is evident in the fact that the color appears when characters face their memories of slavery and the horrific wounds it has caused them. So encountering or confronting the moment of violence, confronting the moment of abuse is exactly what caused them the wound. Again, we can refer back to someone like Catherine Malibu, where they talk about the wounded body, the wounded mind, and how that wound creates a sense of lack or absence, and that can only be compensated by a consumption of the excessive, and we just saw that. Concurringly, red is conspicuously present throughout Paul D's emasculating experiences at Sweet Home and at later stages of his life. His most painful memory of the failed plan to flee from Sweet Home is that of one of the roosters. Mister, he looked so free, better than me, but wasn't no way I'd ever be Paul D again, living or dead. School teacher changed me. I was something else, and that something was less than a chicken sitting in the sun on a tub. When Paul D describes Mr. to Sethe, the bird is connected to red twice, blooded too and evil, calm as big as my hand and some kind of red. Now, we can see how the man-animal relationship in Beloved is interesting because, in a way, it talks about the dehumanization of man and, of course, the anthropomorphization of the animal, how the animal and the man sort of connect together. The bird and the animal, man, are connected together through, presence of abuse and violence and vulnerability, and this connection with the rooster, the chicken, becomes interesting. And Paul D obviously is a very important figure, and his emasculation can be seen as symbolic emasculation, which follows on from racial abuse, the history of racism in America. Other main characters continually exemplify red, symbolizing slavery as well. When Sete appears or arrives in Cincinnati after fleeing Sweet Home, Baby Socks notices that roses of blood blossomed in the blanket covering Sete's shoulders. So we can see how the rose, which is normally a metaphor of a romance and abundance and fertility and beauty and embellishment, how that is transformed in a certain sense into an imagery for violence, an imagery for abuse, right? So it just becomes a symbol of violence, symbol of abuse, a symbol of defeminization, right? And there's a grotesque quality to the rose as well. Now this is again a very, very interesting thing that a literary work can do, a literary language can do, because it can take some metaphors which are normally commonly consumed as something else and transform them entirely into something else, right? Because we can see over here, for instance, the metaphor rose, which is normally a metaphor for romance, fertility, love, peace, all these positive connotations are so transformed into something quite grotesque, gruesome, violent, and obviously cognitively disturbing, right? And that cognitive disturbance or cognitive disconcertedness is there throughout the novel. And as this essay makes abundantly clear, it is reflective of the history of abuse that has sort of been perpetrated across generations of slavery, right? So they belong to what Amy Denver has termed as Sete's choke cherry tree, the web of scars left on her back by school teacher's whip, right? So again, the scars on the back made by the whip of the school teacher, they become quite corporeal markers, physical, bodily markers of abuse, of violence, and which sort of connects to the more macro marker of slavery, the history of it, which is an intergenerational experience of abuse, of violence. Even Beloved, the angry ghost of the child killed so she would not have experienced slavery, follows this pattern, as she's in a pool of red light before she becomes a corporeal presence in the house. Right, so Beloved, who is a spectral presence, the child who was killed to be liberated from the chains of slavery, she becomes associated, or she continually appears associated with red, or the color red. Right, so the redness of Beloved is something which is never lost sight of. It's a red light, so it always appears with a aura of redness. And of course, this aura is not of romance or astonishment, or wonder. It's an aura of abuse. And it's something which the color or the imagery around her is always a very disturbing reminder of abuse and violence and of human loss, right? And a very corporeal as well as existential level. Right, so throughout the entire novel, then, red is used to clearly mark and even amplify the occurrences of slavery's painful influence on its victims, both during slavery and after they're believed to have escaped it, right? So there is that condition of post-memory, there's a condition of re-memory about it. When you remember something which may or may not have happened, when you remember something which may or may not be there in the first place. But throughout these real and virtual orders of remembrance and forgetting, we find that red becomes an abstract as well as a very material marker of abuse, of violence, of grotesqueness, of absence, etc. Right? And that quality of abuse, that quality of intergenerational abuse, which almost becomes a landscape, which almost becomes some kind of a terrain, some kind of a matter, really, rather than just a metaphor, is very palpably present in the novel. So the color red is a matter as well as a metaphor. It symbolizes blood, it symbolizes the wounded body, it symbolizes marks of violence. At the same time, it symbolizes the effect of violence, the psychological condition, or the sufferer of violence, and someone who suffers continuously through silences and evasion. Right, so we see that throughout the novel, running across the novel as an imagery, as a landscape, as a symbol, as well as a matter, a real matter, a palpable matter. Right, so and therein lies the interesting interplay of the spectral and the real, the spectral and the physical in Beloved. So that interplay is always there throughout the novel, throughout the way the novel functions. So now we come to the second section of the essay, the subsequent section, which looks at the red as a text. So you can see there's some kind of a wordplay here as well. So reading the color red as a text, right? So the textuality of the color red, in other words. So as stated above, red is more than just a highlighter in Morrison's text, giving the reader a visual sign that specific passages are of high significance in relation to slavery and its consequences. As the following analysis will show, in its continuous and coherent utilization, red can be read as a text in itself, right? So the textuality of the color red is important. It constitutes a previously neglected dimension of Beloved's elaborately analyzed portrayal of trauma, voicelessness, and the possibilities of healing. Right? So that last bit is interesting, and we see how in almost all the novels you've read so far, I mean, that possibility of healing, the possibility of cure, the possibility of redemption is there. I mean, even has a very, very tenuous presence. So we see that in Slaughterhouse 5, we see that in Nervous Conditions. So despite all the darkness and depthlessness of trauma and the complete agencylessness as well, there is always that lingering residual possibility for change, for transformation, which Beloved also portrays. So the color and the character's interaction with it is one of the manifold ways in which the novel tells the story of the character's processing of these traumas. The first stage of this process can be identified as a complete shock and loss of voice caused by the impact of slavery and on the characters' lives. It is followed by the character's repression of the trauma of slavery and, in his youngest generation, the attainment of agency through telling one's own story. All three of the stages address in their respective ways the voicelessness caused by the trauma of slavery. Now, so we find there are three historical stages, which are also psychological stages. And this is the real complexity of this novel, the way it merges or converges the history of slavery and the psychology of slavery in very, very interesting ways, in very figurative, metaphoric, as well as very, very real, corporeal ways. So broadly speaking, the three stages of slavery are the following. The first stage, which is one of absolute voicelessness, absolute agencylessness, right? This complete agency-lessness, and is just defined by shock and loss of voice, because the impact of slavery is so fresh, is so much of a shudder, so much of a shock, so much of a fresh violence on the character's, the subject's mind, the subject's lives. Then the second stage, where the characters begin to represent the trauma of slavery in a sense that they begin to process the trauma of slavery. At least they become aware of the trauma of slavery. It's not a numbed condition anymore. They begin to experience it and they begin to try to represent it. And the final stage is the youngest generation, is where there's some sense of agency available because they begin to tell the story of slavery, right? So, and telling the story is also a healing mechanism. Telling the story is also some kind of a recuperative mechanism, right? So that recuperation, that redemption, that healing, that coping mechanism also becomes evident in the third stage. Now, we see there is, first of all, an intergenerational quality of slavery. It just cuts across generation, it travels across generation, but it impacts in different ways each generation. Now, what all the three stages have in common, and that's something which the essay states as well, in the respective ways, the voicelessness, the different degrees of voicelessness caused by the trauma of slavery. Now, let's just qualify what is meant by voicelessness, and this is what the essay does here. The term voicelessness denotes a state which does not necessarily and completely preclude any verbal communication, but is marked by a significant loss of the character's ability to express themselves and their trauma, right? So it doesn't mention that, people can't speak. It's a corporeal mortal problem. It's not that, but it's more of a symbolic, existential way, and also connected to agency. I mean, you can speak, you can produce sounds out of your vocal cords, but you cannot really express your opinion. You cannot really express your condition. You cannot really address your condition in a hope of bringing about a change. And that is where voice or voicelessness connects to agency or agencylessness, because agency can be defined, very broadly speaking, as the ability to express your opinion, express your will, with the possibility of bringing about a change. The change may or may not happen, but then at least you have the option, the ability to express or make a difference, to state something, or act out something, which may or may not bring the change. But that option of acting out, that option of expressing is there, and that is agency. Now, These instances result from the shock of facing the horrors of slavery. Carruth argues in the unclaimed experience that a traumatic event is so overwhelming and surprising that it cannot be experienced but only registered. Right? It cannot be experienced but only registered. So in other words, you can just passively consume it, and you can be changed by it, but you cannot really process it. You cannot really register it. You cannot really experience it. Right? You can just register it in a numbed, passive way. Hartman argues that a traumatic event seems to have bypassed perception and consciousness and falls directly into the psyche. So, again, it doesn't really pass through the processing phase. It goes directly into the psyche, and in a way, it maybe alters the psyche, changes the psyche, right? Without the ability, without the phase through which the filtration happens. It just goes and bluntly and directly hits the psyche, right? And in that sense, it bypasses perception and consciousness directly. While Locke puts it more laconically, we have, as it were, nowhere to put it. Right, so trauma becomes a nowhere. Trauma becomes the the other space in the mind, which cannot be processed, which cannot be registered, which cannot be represented. So it just remains some kind of a aporia in the mind. So that is a nowhere. Now, commenting on these statements as to the impossibility of processing traumatic events and hence as to the cognitive unavailability of traumatic memory, trauma theory has produced a significant body of scholarship on the ways in which trauma in general and trauma in beloved in particular is connected to what I call voicelessness. So this is where the essay will begin to map the quality of voicelessness in beloved using or drawing on trauma theory. Whitehead has argued that the trauma at the very moment of its reception registers as a non-experience, causing conventional epistemologists to falter, and thus, in its very nature, the traumatic event resists language or representation. Right. So again, the resistance to language, resistance to representation becomes interesting, right? And that's something which you see even in Catherine Malibu's works. The very ontology of trauma is anti-representation, is anti-language, is anti-registration. So it just falls outside the conventional epistemologies, the conventional knowledge systems, the conventional narrative systems, and hence it is impossible to define or articulate or represent it. In referring Bessel A. van der Kolk and Onno van der Hart, Cohen argues that a response to the state of overwhelming experience has been described as speechless terror, since information can neither be fully assimilated nor accommodated. So the impossibility to assimilate or accommodate information is exactly what causes terror, the speechless terror of trauma. According to Winslow, in connection to states such as slavery, in which traumatization is both prolonged and repeated, the trauma world may develop extensively and to be maintained beside but apart from the ordinary world. So there is an otherworldly quality about trauma, the alternate world of trauma. Thus, as the traumatic experience continues past the time of the event, it remains cognized in the literalness of its tropes. Hence, voicelessness and its troping caused by the traumatic event's overwhelming nature can last long past the event, particularly in revisitations of the event through belated compulsive repetition. And this is the point I'll stop at today in this session. But just to unpack this a little bit, the condition of voicelessness, the condition of numbedness, the condition of just registering without understanding, and that condition can be a belated condition. That condition can go on even long after the traumatic event has expired or the traumatic event had gone away, because there's a repetitive quality of trauma, and each repetition, each revisitation will also sort of reawaken that numbed condition, reawaken that voicelessness. So voicelessness becomes a compulsive condition, voicelessness becomes a recursive condition, and voicelessness becomes a traumatic condition, right? So therein lies the repetitive quality, and there's a classic Freudian quality, which this novel also uses. So we're looking at voicelessness not just as an ontological condition, but also as an experiential repetitive condition. And that quality, that experiential / ontological quality of voicelessness is what characterizes the traumatic mind. That condition, that qualifies the traumatic subject, that characterizes the traumatic subject. So we stop at this point today, and we'll continue with this in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.